The silent labor of millstones, grinding grain across the ages. Stones that fed civilizations. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine the hum of ancient life, you might think of voices in crowded marketplaces, the hammering of metal workers at a forge, or the creak of wooden carts carrying goods along dirt paths. But there was another sound, so steady and so essential that it formed the invisible rhythm of civilizations, the grinding of grain between stone. Whether in Mesopotamia, ancient Rome, medieval Europe, or distant rural villages, millstones quietly transformed harvested crops into flour, turning subsistence farming into survival. In this first part of the story, you will learn how societies depended upon the monotonous, repetitive act of grinding grain. While it may seem unremarkable, this act was at the core of daily existence for millions of people across centuries. The earliest millstones. The origins of grinding grain reach deep into the prehistoric past. Archaeological findings show that as early as 30,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers began experimenting with grinding seeds and roots using simple stones. Flat rocks, used in tandem with smaller handheld stones, left grooves and marks that modern archaeologists recognize as some of the first tools of food preparation. These were not grand or ceremonial tools. They were dull, heavy slabs, handled daily with wear and sweat. The shift from wild grains to cultivated cereals in the Neolithic period magnified the importance of these tools. With the advent of farming, the grinding stone became indispensable. The cornstone, often a flat or slightly concave surface used with a handheld rubber stone, allowed families to convert grain into flour at home. Though effective, it was slow. A single woman, kneeling for hours, might grind enough to feed her family for a single day. Her knees pressed into woven mats, her arms sore from the rocking motion of the stone. This was the daily reality of food preparation. It is difficult for us now, in an era where flour comes in neat paper bags, to imagine the sheer labor bound to every loaf of bread. Grinding was not a background task. It consumed vast hours of human energy, from querns to rotary mills. As societies grew more complex, so too did the technology of grinding. The Romans in particular revolutionized milling by developing the rotary mill. Instead of flat surfaces, two circular stones, one fixed, the other rotating, could process larger quantities of grain with greater efficiency. These mills were powered not only by human strength, but also by animals, water, and later, wind. Animal-driven mills, known as hourglass mills, were common in Roman towns. Donkeys or mules were harnessed to turn the heavy upper stones, walking in circles for hours, much as women had once knelt for hours. The substitution of animal energy did not reduce the centrality of the work, it only shifted the burden. Even more transformative were watermills. As early as the 1st century BCE, Roman engineers began constructing mills that harnessed rivers and streams to drive wooden gears and rotate massive millstones. One of the most famous examples is the Barbegal watermill complex in southern France, a site that housed 16 watermills and may have ground enough flour to feed an entire regional population. Here we see the grinding of grain scaling from a domestic chore to an industrial process, an unassuming industry shaping economies. The daily burden of grinding. Despite these advances, the reality of grain processing remained physically punishing for the majority of the population. In villages across Europe, Africa, and Asia, quernstones persisted well into the medieval period and beyond. Many households could not afford access to large mills, and grinding grain remained women's work, repeated daily, unchanging in its demands. Accounts from travelers and historians describe women beginning their grinding before dawn. The rhythmic scrape of stone against stone was as common as the crowing of roosters. In medieval villages, this sound was a marker of daily time. Kneeling, bending forward, and moving arms in long, repetitive arcs, women's bodies bore the evidence of this labor: worn joints, stooped backs, and calloused hands. We also find glimpses of this work preserved in art. Medieval manuscripts occasionally depict women at querns, bent over with concentration, their faces expressionless, as though resigned to the endlessness of the task. To modern eyes, these illustrations may look almost decorative, but for the people who lived it, this was survival work. The mill as community center. By the medieval period, communal mills, particularly watermills, became not just economic hubs, but social ones as well. Lords and landowners often monopolized milling technology, forcing peasants to bring their grain to the lord's mill and pay fees in flour or coin. These arrangements, called banal mills, tied the act of grinding grain directly to the structures of feudal power. Mills were usually positioned at the edge of villages, near running water or on a rise where wind could be caught. Families would carry heavy sacks of grain, sometimes walking long distances to have them ground. Waiting for the milling to be finished, villagers often exchanged news, gossip, and grievances. In some ways, the mill was like the tavern or the church, a space where individual lives overlapped with communal rhythms. Yet the dependence on mills also created tension. Records from the Middle Ages describe disputes between villagers and millers, with accusations of unfair tolls or of millers skimming extra flour for themselves. The very technology that freed people from hours of grinding also bound them to systems of obligation and power. A forgotten soundscape. If you could step into a medieval town, the soundscape might surprise you. The tolling of church bells is often remembered, but just as constant was the groan of millstones. Wooden gears creaked, water splashed against wheels, and stone ground against stone in a low, steady drone. The sound was neither beautiful nor particularly noticeable to those living among it, but it was the background hum of life. This sound carried a meaning deeper than convenience. It symbolized food security. When mills ran, flour was produced, bread was baked, and communities were sustained. When mills fell silent, whether due to drought, flood, or war, hunger followed. Thus, the grinding of grain, so dull and so repetitive, was at the very core of survival. Reflections on boredom and necessity. The grinding of grain has been with us so long that its history stretches almost invisibly through the centuries. The corn stones of the Neolithic, the donkey-powered mills of Rome, the watermills of medieval Europe. All of these are variations of the same central act, reducing grain to flour. It is an act that rarely drew praise or celebration. No epic poem exalts the millstone. Few monuments commemorate the woman kneeling at her quern. Yet without this constant, boring work, the grand narratives of kings and empires could not have unfolded. Think for a moment of the immense human time spent turning seeds into flour. How many hands pressed against stone? How many backs bent over querns? How many rivers spun the wheels of mills? This collective labor, unnoticed in history books, was the lifeblood of civilizations. Closing thought. As you consider this first part of the story, imagine the hum of the millstone in the background of history. Imagine the thousands of lives tied to the slow rhythm of grinding grain day after day. This is the sound of survival, invisible yet essential. But how did this grinding, so basic and repetitive, become entangled in power, control, and even resistance? What happened when the right to grind grain became a matter of law and privilege rather than simple necessity? Lords, laws, and the politics of flour. When we left the hum of the millstone at the end of Section 1, it seemed like a simple matter. Grain went in, flour came out, and bread followed. But as villages grew, as feudal power structures took root, and as economies began to organize themselves in increasingly controlled ways, even this most basic task of survival was folded into systems of privilege, taxation, and conflict. The very act of grinding grain, once performed by every household at its quern, was transformed into a matter of law. In this section, we will look at how medieval lords turned the mill into a symbol of control, how peasants navigated the burdens of these laws, and how disputes around flour quietly shaped the social fabric of Europe. The rise of the banal mill. In medieval Europe, particularly between the 9th and 13th centuries, landholding lords began asserting their rights not only over land, but also over tools and resources that communities depended on. This included ovens, wine presses, and, perhaps most significantly, mills. The concept of the banal mill, from the medieval French word ban, meaning authority or jurisdiction, required villagers to grind their grain exclusively at the lord's mill. Private querns, those small handheld grinding stones families had used for centuries, were sometimes outlawed or even confiscated. The rationale was both economic and political. By monopolizing the milling process, lords ensured a steady income through milling fees, usually taken as a portion of the flour produced. But beyond profit, this also reinforced the authority of the lord over the daily lives of peasants. Imagine the frustration of a family who, for generations, had ground their own flour at home. Suddenly, they were required to walk to the communal mill, wait in line, pay a toll, and accept the possibility that the miller, employed by the lord, might accidentally keep a bit of their flour. The figure of the miller, Millers became infamous figures in medieval folklore and literature. Unlike peasants who toiled openly in the fields, millers worked behind walls, in dusty, noisy rooms where stone and gear met. The toll system meant that a portion of everyone's flour passed through the miller's hands, creating endless opportunities for suspicion. The Miller's Tale in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales reflects this perception. Millers were often depicted as shrewd, dishonest, or sly. Popular sayings accused millers of having three thumbs or always holding back a hand of flour. Whether fair or not, such reputations reveal the tension between villagers who depended on mills and the individuals who ran them. Yet it is important to note that not all millers were wealthy or corrupt. Many were themselves caught between their obligations to lords and the frustrations of their neighbors. Millers were sometimes paid poorly and often accused unjustly. The dusty work of tending millstones was physically grueling. Stones needed constant dressing, resharpening. Gears broke, floods damaged wheels, and droughts stopped rivers. To keep flour flowing required a near-constant battle with wood, stone, water, and weather. Laws against hand querns. The most resented aspect of feudal milling rights was the outlawing of hand querns. Archaeological finds across Europe reveal quern stones hidden in walls, buried in fields, or stashed away in secret. These illegal stones were kept because peasants resisted giving up the right to grind their own grain. Records show instances of lords confiscating querns from peasants. In some regions, possessing a hand quern was punishable by fines or seizure. In others, millers were tasked with inspecting households for hidden stones. This was not merely about efficiency or economics, it was about authority. The banning of querns symbolized the reach of feudal control into the smallest domestic spaces. One can imagine the scene. A peasant family huddling over their concealed quern at night, quietly grinding enough flour to bake a loaf, hoping no one would hear the faint scrape of stone on stone. A task that once defined the ordinary rhythm of life had become an act of quiet defiance. Mills as economic hubs. Beyond the social and legal tensions, mills were also vital economic centers. In towns, the presence of a large watermill or windmill could attract bakers, brewers, and merchants. Flour was not only for bread, it was also a key ingredient for beer and ale, which were staples of medieval diets. Thus, control of the mill meant control of wider economic networks. In some places, mills became so profitable that towns invested in municipal mills owned collectively by the community rather than a single lord. These civic mills served both economic and political functions, demonstrating the ability of towns to claim independence from feudal lords. The architecture of mills, too, reflected their importance. Large stone watermills were among the most imposing non-religious buildings in medieval landscapes. With tall wooden wheels turning ceaselessly and stone buildings echoing with the sound of grinding, mills were monuments to persistence and control. Windmills, harnessing the air. While watermills dominated much of medieval Europe, windmills emerged as an alternative where rivers were absent or unreliable. The first clear records of European windmills date to the late 12th century. These mills, with their tall wooden frames and large sails, dotted landscapes from England to the Low Countries. Windmills were technically challenging to build and maintain, but they offered communities independence from rivers and streams. In windy regions, they became symbols of ingenuity and local adaptation. Yet they too often fell under the same legal frameworks as watermills, subject to lordly monopolies and milling fees. Conflict and resistance. As one might expect, the imposition of milling monopolies led to resistance. Legal disputes fill medieval records. Villagers sued lords over excessive milling tolls, and communities sometimes petitioned for the right to maintain small quorns. In extreme cases, villagers destroyed mills in protest, though such acts were rare given the severe punishments they risked. In England, for example, manorial court records from the 13th century document cases of peasants accused of secretly grinding grain at home or of carrying their grain to mills outside their lord's domain. Each case reflects the tension between the necessity of flour and the structures of power built around it. The conflicts over mills may seem small compared to wars or royal decrees, but they reveal the ways ordinary people negotiated their survival within oppressive systems. Bread was daily life, and flour was its foundation. Thus, even disputes about flour tolls were, in their own way, disputes about dignity, autonomy, and fairness. The mill as a symbol. By the later Middle Ages, mills had become deeply symbolic in European culture. They were symbols of abundance and prosperity when functioning smoothly, and of greed and corruption when controlled unjustly. Folk tales often featured mills as enchanted places, where grain flowed endlessly or where millers struck deals with supernatural beings. These stories reflected both the wonder and suspicion mills inspired. In art, mills appeared in the background of pastoral scenes, their steady wheels suggesting the constancy of rural life. Yet for those who lived within earshot, the creak of the wheel and the groan of stone was not merely symbolic. It was the sound of labor owed, of fees collected, of bread gained or withheld. Closing thought. In this section, you have seen how the humble act of grinding grain became wrapped in the structures of medieval power. Lords claimed rights over mills. Millers became contested figures, and peasants carried both burdens and resentments in their sacks of grain. The mill was not only a place of flour production, it was a site of law, economy, and quiet rebellion. But how did this story end? Did technological innovation or social change eventually free people from these grinding obligations? Or did the rhythm of the millstone continue to dominate daily life long after other parts of medieval society began to shift? From feudal obligations to industrial wheels. By the time the late medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and early modern world, the sound of the millstone had already shaped centuries of daily life. Villagers had endured the obligations of banal mills. Millers had lived with suspicion and responsibility, and lords had profited from the endless toll of flour. But nothing in history stays fixed. Just as rivers carve new channels and winds shift direction, the systems of control around milling began to loosen. What followed was a slow but steady transformation, from local feudal monopolies to municipal freedoms, from wooden wheels to iron gears, and finally from village mills to industrial factories of flour. This final section will carry us through that transition, showing how one of the oldest human tasks, the grinding of grain, remained central even as the world around it changed. The slow decline of feudal milling rights. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cracks had begun to show in the rigid system of banal mills. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, played a role in weakening manorial control. With so many peasants dead, lords found it harder to enforce monopolies and collect fees. Surviving villagers, more valuable as laborers, sometimes negotiated freedoms, including the ability to grind grain on their own terms. Towns and cities, too, increasingly resisted feudal claims. Civic authorities built and managed municipal mills, arguing that communities should benefit from flour production rather than individual lords. These communal mills became important both practically and symbolically, marking the growing independence of towns. Legal disputes over milling rights continued, but over time the feudal stranglehold weakened. By the early modern period, peasants were less likely to be prosecuted for hidden querns, and private mills operated with greater freedom. The struggle over grinding rights, once a defining feature of village life, became one of many old feudal practices fading into the background. The persistence of tradition. Yet even as monopolies faded, the traditional rhythms of milling persisted. For many families, the local mill remained central to community life. The wheel turned, the stones ground, and villagers brought their sacks of grain as they always had. In many ways, the decline of feudal control did not mean an immediate transformation of daily life. It meant, rather, a shift in who collected the fees and who maintained the equipment. Folklore continued to cast millers in ambiguous roles. Tales of trickery, theft, or deals with dark forces did not vanish with the end of feudal monopolies. Instead, they evolved, echoing older suspicions of the mill's hidden labor. At the same time, some stories romanticized mills, painting them as places of abundance or as settings for pastoral love and rustic simplicity. The cultural image of the mill was thus double-edged. It could be a symbol of oppression or of timeless rural charm. Renaissance innovation and engineering. The Renaissance brought renewed attention to engineering and mechanics, and mills were part of this wave of innovation. Inventors and engineers tinkered with gears, sluices, and sails, seeking to improve efficiency. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, sketched designs for mills with more sophisticated gear systems. In parts of Europe, multiple sets of millstones were operated by the same water wheel, allowing greater output. Windmill technology also spread and diversified, with post mills and tower mills adapting to different landscapes. These improvements may seem minor compared to the Industrial Revolution that would come later, but they mattered deeply to the communities that depended on them. Faster grinding meant more flour, and more flour meant more bread, a crucial buffer in times of scarcity. The Industrial Revolution and roller mills. The real upheaval came in the 18th and 19th centuries with the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, iron machinery, and later electricity transformed milling. The great shift was from millstones to roller mills. Traditional millstones ground grain by crushing it between two rough surfaces. This method worked well, but produced flour with varying textures and left behind bran and germ that limited shelf life. In contrast, roller mills use steel rollers to separate the parts of the grain more effectively, producing finer, whiter, and longer-lasting flour. These new mills were massive, often located in industrial cities rather than rural streams. Instead of the quiet creak of a wooden wheel on a village river, flour was now produced in great quantities inside roaring factories powered by coal and steam. The transformation was profound. Bread, once a local product made from flour ground at the neighborhood mill, became increasingly industrial, standardized, and distant from the families who consumed it. The end of the local mill. With industrialization, many traditional mills fell into disuse. The little watermills that had once dotted European and American landscapes could not compete with the efficiency of roller mills. By the late 19th century, countless village mills were abandoned, their wheels stilled, and their stones left to gather dust. Some were converted into homes, barns, or storage buildings. Others fell into ruin, reclaimed by rivers and vegetation. A few survived as heritage sites, their creaking wheels maintained for the sake of history rather than necessity. For the villagers who once depended on them, their absence must have been both liberating and disorienting. No longer bound to the lord's tolls or the miller's reputation, they were also disconnected from the steady communal rhythm that had tied generations together. The mill as memory. Even after their practical decline, mills retained a powerful place in memory and imagination. Poets and painters of the Romantic era found inspiration in ruined mills, portraying them as picturesque remnants of a slower age. The sound of a turning wheel or the sight of sails against the sky evoked nostalgia for a rural past, even as cities and factories redefined daily life. In literature, mills often became symbols of lost simplicity or of human endurance against the passage of time. Folk songs continued to mention millers and mill girls, embedding their figures in cultural memory. Today, many restored mills operate as museums or tourist sites, inviting visitors to witness the old technology in action. The hum of stone on grain, recreated for demonstration, carries echoes of centuries when that sound was the heartbeat of survival, a continuity across time. Despite all these changes, the act of grinding grain remains with us. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, every slice of cake carries within it the story of the millstone. Whether crushed between ancient hand querns, turned beneath the shadow of feudal lords, or rolled by industrial steel, grain has always demanded transformation before it could sustain human life. If you listen closely, You can almost hear the continuity, the scrape of stone, the creak of wood, the hum of gears, the whir of rollers. Across millennia, these sounds have tied human survival to the steady, repetitive labor of grinding. Closing reflection. The story of the mill is not one of dramatic battles or sudden upheavals. It is a story of persistence, of structures of control imposed and resisted, of technology that both liberated and alienated. It is a story that demonstrates how something as ordinary as flour could shape laws, economies, and cultures. As you reflect on this, consider, in our own time, when food is purchased in uniform packages and bread is made by machines, have we truly moved beyond the millstone's rhythm? Or do we remain, in some hidden way, tied to the endless, steady grind that has accompanied humanity since the first stone met grain?